The Bill of Rights clearly specifies what the government may not do to the people. It may not punish us for speaking or printing our opinion, or for protesting against the government. It may not take away our guns. It may not search us or our homes without a warrant. It may not jail us without a just cause, and it must provide us with a quick trial so that innocent men are set free as soon as possible. The trial a man receives must be by a jury of his peers so that corrupt judges cannot jail him unjustly. And for a detailed exposition on the Bill of Rights, I would highly recommend Jacob Hornberger's 11-part series on the Bill of Rights, which started in the July 2004 edition of Freedom Daily. And to make it clear that this list of protected rights were not the only rights that citizens have, because that is why they did not initially want to have a Bill of Rights, as it would imply that these were the only rights that citizens had. The Ninth Amendment states explicitly that this enumeration of rights, quote, shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Now, this framework held fast until the beginning of the 20th century. As Richard Ebling noted, the 19th century in particular was a time of great innovation, freedom, and progress. But as progressivism and eventually the New Deal took the country by storm, the federal government began to exercise its power over more and more aspects of everyday life, in the process infringing upon the liberties that the people of the 18th and 19th centuries took for granted. The framers also had a clear idea of how their country should act on the world stage. Fortune had brought them a country separated from most of the world's problems by two vast oceans. They had recently waged a long-fought, hard-won war against an imperial government, and they simply wanted a government that would leave them alone. 8 years after the Constitution was ratified, George Washington gave sage advice on foreign policy in his farewell address. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our external relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. Europe has a set of primary interests which to us have none or a very remote relation. Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our own concerns. James Madison knew that warfare, even those started within the government itself, could be detrimental to the health of the republic, saying, if tyranny and oppression come to this land, it will be in the guise of fighting a foreign enemy. And John Jay warned in Federalist No. 4, the safety of the people of America against dangers from foreign force depends not only on their forbearing to give just causes of war to other nations, but also on their placing and continuing in themselves in such a situation as not to invite hostility or insult, for it need not be observed that there are pretended as well as just causes of war. So how were the framers to protect this nation from unjust war? They knew that too much power concentrated in the hands of any one man or any group of men eventually led to despotism. What provisions did the Constitution have that would attempt to limit the government to only the most necessary of wars? Like so many other functions of government, the Constitution, the powers that were needed to implement foreign policy were divided between the executive and the legislative branches. The power to declare war was given to Congress, but the president was the one with the power to wage it. The president may wish to wage war, but he needed to get the declaration from Congress first. And even if a president was successful in getting his declaration, Congress had the power to stop the war by cutting off the money that funded it. The system of checks and balances, so highly regarded by historians, was supposed to prevent the ascension of a tyrannical government. Instead of enabling one man to determine when the country was to go to war, the Constitution saw to it that different parts of the federal government would have to debate and ultimately agree among themselves that war was the proper route. When war fever took the grip of a nation, as it does to every nation, always will, always has, it was hoped that the built-in tension between the executive and the legislative branches would enable cooler heads to prevail and avert non-defensive wars. In theory, special interests that were motivated to start war for personal gain would be thwarted by the majority of those in Congress not willing to suffer unnecessary warfare. And unlike the monarchs that ruled most of the civilized countries of the world in the 18th century, the Constitution stopped one man from doing that. When Congress did decide to take the nation to war, when they decided that it was a defensive war worthy of taking the whole nation into battle, the president would then assume the power of commander-in-chief. But that wasn't enough for the framers. They were still afraid of too powerful an executive. In the event that he began to abuse his power, for example, by invading additional countries or even turning the army on U.S. citizens, Congress could pull the plug. The Constitution mandates that if Congress raises an army, it cannot fund it for any longer than a 2-year period. This provides a relief valve in case the Army or the President gets out of hand. The Congress simply refuses to renew the spending bill. This system, that is, separating the powers to declare, wage, and fund war, served our nation fairly well from its inception through the 1800s. But as the new century dawned, Americans found that their government had imperial ambitions and that their army was spread across the globe. U.S. soldiers could be found supporting a puppet regime in Hawaii. With a cry of "Remember the Maine," the government turned George Washington's maxim of disentanglement on its head by declaring war on Spain and sending its soldiers to the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Seeking a canal across Central America, the U.S. military played an instrumental role in Panama's secession from Colombia. And more than 100,000 Americans lost their lives fighting in World War I, which of course was the war to end all wars. We have had a few since then. The words of Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and FDR were a far cry from those of the framers. Instead of observing good faith and justice toward all nations, Americans heard that they should speak softly and carry a big stick. They heard Woodrow Wilson tell them that armed neutrality is ineffectual at best. And Franklin Roosevelt instructed that we must be the great arsenal of democracy. Now, during the period between the Spanish-American War and World War II, while the federal government was expanding an imperial foreign policy, at least the declaration of war requirement was still being heeded. In the conflicts of those times, the president still asked Congress for declaration because the Constitution required him to secure it, and they were at least paying lip service to the Constitution. Presidents do not bother with such niceties any longer. Congress has not issued a declaration of war against any nation since World War II, a span of more than 60 years. Yet since World War II, U.S. troops have been deployed over 70 times to over 40 countries with more than 98,000 U.S. dead and 279,000 wounded. The Constitution no longer changed the military or the president as it was designed to do. The chains weakened as the progressive movement gripped the country and as an imperial mindset sent American soldiers far and wide. When the U.S. government began to impose its will on nations of the world following World War II, the Constitution was eventually ignored and forgotten. Most people today cannot even name the 3 branches of government, much less explain the separation of powers doctrine. In the span of 220 years, our republic evolved from one of enumerated powers, narrowly defined by the Constitution, to an extremely powerful, highly centralized, militant government that is forever extending the boundaries of its power.